I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. This week I'm speaking to Toby Diggens, who runs Dig & Co, a design studio focusing on ecological landscape design and architecture. I met Toby through our mutual friend Butter Wakefield, and firstly, I'd like to say a big thank you to Butter for introducing me to Toby, because I could tell as soon as I spoke to him that he had fascinating and interesting ideas about what gardens and landscapes could be if we let the wilderness in. Toby's interest is in creating landscapes that echo the native landscape surrounding a site, and he experiments with a wider palette of plants that includes as much from the hedgerow as from the garden centre. I started by asking Toby to fill us in on exactly what makes his style of design special.
I love wild landscapes, whether it's wildernesses or gardens which have a sort of wild aspect added into them for a certain aesthetic. I really enjoy spending time travelling not only around the UK but also around Europe, studying these plant communities and wildernesses and how the landscape looks in, as far as I can see, some of the most beautiful places in Europe. And that's really the kind of inspiration I get from them. Okay. I think natural gardens in general are things which I find exciting, and there's a sort of dynamism within them which potentially goes a little bit beyond something that's a little bit more abstract and potentially textural for the sake of that one design idea. Mm-hmm. With that, I suppose, comes the fact that the gardens that I like to create and the landscapes that I like to create have a very strong link to the place that they originally were from. So a sort of historic look back at the landscape pre its development, for example, might offer up a certain set of design considerations which then add a lot of depth to the landscape and then potentially the plants and the structure that you put into it. Mm-hmm. And I suppose to say, if I have a name for what I do, I've been grappling with this ever since, this kind of idea of wild landscapes, wild gardening, and I suppose evoking wilderness came along, and about the best I've got to so far is aesthetic ecology, mm-hmm. where essentially you take the constructs and the laws of ecology and then you peg them to the fact that all people love a beautiful thing. And so a true wilderness potentially might jar with you because it would be lots of brambles, for example, and that's not necessarily aesthetic unless that's what you find aesthetic, but typically that's not. So it's about blending the ecological capacity of the site with its opportunities to be very beautiful.
So why is that style of gardening important to you?
It comes from I suppose, a deep place within me. I was brought up in the countryside and brought up amongst sort of more wild places, and throughout my life I've always tended to travel to those wild places, and as a consequence, when I got into landscape architecture, it was a natural progression, I suppose, was to essentially evoke the landscapes that I loved being within. And it's just been over time that I've sort of learned about them and studied them. It's important also, I suppose, because of the fact that we're living in a time where the human pressure on natural environments is ever more known about and potentially ever increasing. Mm-hmm. And so the chance for a landscape architect or anybody, to be honest, to have an opportunity to show off what natural beauty can offer, not only from a very aesthetic standpoint, but also from a functional standpoint of the green space is actually doing a lot for people health-wise, but also structurally. It's taking CO2 out of the air, it's cleaning the air, potentially it's cleaning the watercourses as well. So I suppose it's again that blend of the ecosystem working alongside the aesthetics, which is why it's important. So you feel like every time you make a move and you create a design, you're potentially having not only a positive impact on the beauty of the place, but also the actual sort of structural function of it.
That's quite interesting. I mean, you did actually answer one of my later questions, which was that you should consider the place in which you're siting the garden or the landscape that you're working on to see what grows there naturally and what would have been the natural state of things. So how do you know how far to take the design aspect of it? Is that where you as a designer comes in?
it all depends on the collaboration that you're undertaking with the client. And so you have to obviously match potentially the client's desires, dreams, hopes with potentially your knowledge of the natural capacity of the site.
Mm-hmm.
And it's treading that really interesting path to deliver, the end result, as it were, which can be a great journey, because I may come to a site and I'll look at it and I'll say, cool, look at this, these certain types of plants. And a client may say, well, I don't really want those. And yet what you could then potentially do is work within the brief to actually sort of re-include those at a later level in a more aesthetic environment. And as a consequence, they become less jarring.
Yeah.
I think it's about being completely open to the fact that everybody has ways and they have inspiration that comes from everywhere. And yet I suppose one thing that it's nice to be able to do when you come to a site is to start slowly but surely potentially educating people into the vibrancy and the dynamism which potentially already exists within the site, which can be phenomenal. And I'll just take a tiny example. I went to a great friend of mine's garden the other day who was really keen on getting some advice about what to do, and it's on a very steep slope. It turns out the people before had created this phenomenal, wildlife garden with just meadows sweeping over this hillside and beautiful hazel coppice. And I said, if it was me, the softest touch possible here will bring this garden back to life. And there's no doubt that it was a little bit ramshackle in places and a little bit of management wouldn't have gone amiss, but the main architecture of the site was actually already pretty amazing. So quite a good canvas to work off of to start with.
And do you think there'd ever be a time where you actually went somewhere and just went, do you know what, this is perfect as it is?
I suppose yes is the answer. I suppose I would hope for that in a funny sort of way, because that's the landscapes that I've been inspired by. So if I was to walk into a landscape and there was this phenomenal set of plant communities and magical architecture and light that was playing off the trees in a special way, I would get goosebumps and I would say, I don't think I can do any work here. But in reality, I think that you're very rarely walking into a designed wilderness, as it were. And so there might always be suggestions that you could make. And typically, if you are being called upon for your advice and your services, for example, it's normally tied to the construction of a new house or a new owner. And so even if all it is a management report where you're just suggesting methods of maintaining the landscape that is there today, you've still potentially got a part to play. Because as we both know, doing what we do, a landscape is the only kind of artistic creation which never sits still.
Yeah, that's very true. So when you say that you work with people who are building houses or typically redoing things, because you like the natural aesthetic, do you think that would mean that you eschew hard landscaping, or is that something that you embrace?
It's always been a really interesting question in my mind. How close can you drag the landscape back up to the house? And I think that with new technologies and new designs and new ways of people thinking about the holistic approach to designing a site, there is the potential to maybe do away with a little bit of hard landscaping in places. Nonetheless, I 100% recognise the fact that, and agree with the fact that designed places for people, which create routes through a garden to essentially a pergola or a deck leaning out over a pond, is no bad thing, because actually it allows you to embrace the landscape more. And in a domestic scenario, it's one of those things that lends itself to a design where if you were to walk 1,000 times to your pond without hard landscaping, it would be a muddy path. And so you think to yourself, well, it does just make perfect sense to actually pave the path beautifully.
Yeah.
And so when you finish the work and your client's happy and he or she's got their mates coming around, they've got something to be proud of. And at the end of it could be the beautiful biological aspect, I suppose, of the landscape architecture that shows itself off better because of what you've done to enhance the landscape from a hard perspective. So I don't think it's a bad thing to do hard landscaping, although I would say that in housing developments, where hard landscaping is used willy-nilly as a way of designing efficiency and convenience in, there should probably be a bit of a check on that. And that's where the idea of obviously sustainable drainage systems and permeable paving potentially comes into its own. So quite a good debate.
Well, I think it's very much a misnomer that hard landscaping is low or no maintenance, because it's not, and it's got a finite life, whereas something that's green and natural can evolve, as you say. So it's not always just an easy solution to just bung in.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Yeah, and it is very expensive, in lots of ways. Obviously, I think probably your clients come to you because, they respect the way that you design, and that's probably what you're known for and what you will become more known for. But do you think on the whole, it is a little bit of an uphill battle to get people to appreciate wilderness a little bit more? Do you think we're not quite there yet with our appreciation of it as an aesthetic?
That's a really good question. I think that the appreciation of wilderness is definitely something which there probably needs to be more of it, but it would be a very good idea for people to spend potentially more time within wilderness, or at least perceived wilder areas, because then they would potentially start to understand the kind of structure and the overall beauty. I think a lot of potential wildernesses are brought to people through media, and it's hard to actually appreciate all of the different aspects and be kind of clothed in the experience, as it were. I think that we're sort of touching on a really interesting time in landscape architecture and in design in general, which is that we're becoming aware of our impact when we develop things. I'm not sure of the exact number, but quite a large percentage of carbon dioxide emissions are created by the development industry, so, construction. And that must include landscape in cities, for example. I think there is a great opportunity, and it's exciting to be able to be a part of a team of people who sort of sit at the intersection between traditional architecture and building things in a hard manner, and very much what the biological aspects of the world can do to potentially help and enhance the built form of cities and gardens. So I do think that it does probably take a little bit of potentially educating and, just gentle sort of pushing towards maybe a slightly more evocative, slightly more exciting vision than maybe the one that a client has thought up themselves. And I suppose that's where you could say the value a landscape architect or a landscape designer comes in, is that not necessarily just about bringing your ideas, but it's about actually bringing the ideas of the client out more. And with that will obviously come your ideas and the way that your ideas are grounded. And so you will probably together push that design, or certainly in my case, will push that design to more of sort of wild, natural aesthetic, which hopefully, after every job, shows itself beautifully and becomes something that people, would look for and hope for in the future.
I think that, without wishing to sound too airy-fairy, I think that those wilder landscapes do touch people, but maybe on a more subconscious level. And I think perhaps it's a language that we've slightly forgotten. So I don't think we've forgotten it that much. It's just maybe buried a bit deep. So people do perhaps need a bit of prodding to kind of appreciate it. In my garden this year, I've been quite outrageous, and I've left lots of weeds, so-called weeds and wildflowers, to just do their thing. So on a kind of domestic scale, I'm always aware that people are talking about plants for pollinators, but should we be thinking about plants that provide food for, say, the larval stages of insects? Do we need to be thinking about sources that are beyond just nectar and pollen? Yeah,
absolutely. I think the pollinator thing is a fantastic headline for the plight of insects, and I'm sure that we've all read the headlines about there being large declines in insects over the last sort of 35, 40 years, which is tragic, obviously, and something that, again, we can hope to be a part of reversing. But I think that there's absolutely no doubt that focusing on pollinators could potentially push you in the direction where you may actually be not having any long-lasting benefits for the site overall. So when you design your garden, for example, you should be thinking about the structure of it, not just in the flowers, but also in all the different types of leaves, all the different types of plants. And there's an amazing study done that I read when I was just